Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel Airbus What's It Doing Now, and to this video on focusing on the flare. This is coming out of an article from Airbus Safety First magazine. It was written in September 2020 and concerning a number of incidents that were reported to Airbus in the preceding 2 years on incorrect flare leading to bounce landings and tail strikes. It also leads on nicely from the balk landing video which I did recently, and if you want access to that I'll put a link up the top here. It's in the members section, so if you're already a member of the channel you'll be able to access that straight away. If you're not, just head to the channel homepage, and at the head of the page you'll see a join button. Click on the link there and then follow the instructions, and that will take you into the members area. If you're not able to access that, or you prefer to remain on the free side of the channel, then it's probably a good idea at this point, before going into this, is to review what guidance there is in the FCOM and the FCTM about go around close to the ground and bounce landings. There's some good guidance in there about the technique to adopt in both those events, because the events that we're going to study now concern bounce landings and tail strikes, and there's a nice write-up in the FCTM about that, including tail strike awareness and avoidance, which all links in quite nicely. Good. Okay, so let's have a look at what this article covers. Like I said, there's 2 events in here, but it's just a nice reminder also about the flare technique and what we're looking to achieve. What environmental effects might affect a flare height, side stick control and what we're trying to achieve here, thrust lever management and the importance of bringing the thrust levers to idle and what happens when we don't do that, and also a reminder of the importance of pilot monitoring. Can't be overstated really in everything that we do, but particularly in this case, and in particularly in scenario 1, which we'll talk about, there are plenty of opportunities there to abort this landing much earlier on, you know, pilot monitoring has as much a responsibility in the outcome of the flight as the pilot flying does. Okay, so it's a nice reminder there of the importance of effective pilot monitoring. Okay, so let's have a look at the events in 2 events. The first one concerns an A320 and the second one an A321. I'll put up some descriptions up and around the screen as we go through the exercise, as I normally do. The 2 events are slightly different circumstances, but they have similar sort of key learning points. And both of them involve some significant damage to the aircraft as well, quite significant, particularly in the first event. But I'll come on to those in a moment. What I also want to say before moving on, as is with all of these safety focus all these safety focus events that we discuss on this side of the channel, it's not to point the finger at the crew. You should have done this, you should have done that. We're very lucky with Airbus and perhaps other manufacturers as well, in the ability to have access to this information. First of all, from the crews prepared to share the event, for Airbus to take the time to write it, and for us then to be able to learn from it, learn from other crews' experiences, so that we're all better for it. So it's not to point the finger, more to take home some learning points from each of these events. So the focus on landing flare intro talks about several cases of aircraft touching down with their nose landing gear first, or hard landings reported to Airbus in the last 2 years. Remember, this was September 2020 when this article was written. The article will present some key points coming from the analysis of 2 of these incidents, and recall the operational recommendations for performing the fair flays and that are key to ensuring a safe landing. So the first case study is a bounce landing, nose gear impact, tail strike on the go around. So this was a particularly bad day, but lots to get from this. So let's go through the event description first. It's an A320 was on final approach segment of its ILS configured in landing config full. The pilot flying disconnected the autopilot at 370 feet rad out, kept the auto thrust on at 200 feet. Tailwind variations caused the airspeed to drop below the approach. So I highlighted in the balk landing video I did recently that increasing tailwinds was one of the contributing factors to tail strikes. So we'll see through this event that it played quite a major part. From 100 feet radio altimeter and below, high tailwind gradients maintained the airspeed below VAP -5. Now, of course, that's one of the PM callouts, isn't it, for speed? And despite auto thrust increase and reaching a minimum of 119 knots, which was VAP -20 at 5 foot rad out. So quite a significant decrease in the speed there. Could that be deemed transient? I don't think so. We talk about transient conditions, particularly in gusty conditions, can't we? And we look at that as a temporary condition, which is rectified either by the pilots or by the automation, and it's making the correct and appropriate corrections. So from -5 to -20 is quite significant. So yeah, that needs expanding on, doesn't it, really, as to what your definition of transient, and certainly worth talking about in the brief. But of course, we've got our SOP course, haven't we, in speed variation and when you would call out speed. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail about how you might have avoided this. So on to phase 2 then. The pilot flying performed the flare at 14 feet and at the same time started to slowly push the thrust levers above the climb detent. So probably noticing significant sink rate and tried to arrest that perhaps. Remember, the manual thrust is activated now, so as soon as you come out of climb and notch that out of the climb detent, you're now in manual thrust. And of course, with the thrust levers not idle, you're not going to get ground spoilers either. So at this point now, the thrust levers are in the climb detent. They commenced the flare. The aircraft touched down on its main landing gear and then bounced back up into the air again. During the bounce, a pitch call out was triggered, which is what you'd expect when you reach a certain pitch angle on the Airbus 320. Remember, we only get this in the air. So I think what's happened here is to try to arrest the sink rate by keeping the thrust levers out of the climb detent, and also the nose attitude was quite high, again, to probably try and arrest that sink rate. So they've now got pitch as the aircraft has bounced. The pilot flying pulled full nose down order. That's a bit of a funny way of writing it. Pulled. No, it doesn't say pulled. It says applied. So my mistake. The pilot flying applied full nose down order and retarded the thrust levers to idle. So up in the bounce now, gets pitch it full forward and retards the thrust levers to idle. This triggered an extension of the ground spoilers, leading to the aircraft to heavily impact the runway, first with its nose gear and then with the main landing gear. So full forward, idle thrust, a recovery from the bounce, the nose gear strikes, followed by the main gear. It's like a pivot. The impact of the nose gear resulted in another sudden increase in the aircraft's pitch, so bounce up from the nose, and pitch call out triggered for a second time. The pilot flying initiated the go-around by setting toga thrust and applying full nose up command. There was a tail strike as the aircraft lifted off the runway at 133 knots. Again, there's some good guidance here in the FCTM about go-around close to the ground, and also covered in my balk landing brief about the sort of pitch attitude to maintain. So quite a significant event there, a sort of an initial bounce of the high nose attitude, then a full forward nose down applied with the thruster idle. The nose gear then impacted quite heavily, followed by the main gear, and then another bounce up into the air, quite significant, at which point then toga thrust was applied as a go around, and of course full backstick now. Of course the tail is going to strike. Remember, there's no pitch sort of protection when the aircraft's in the air. There's only the audible warning. Of course, the ELAC standard 93, which I've already discussed in the bulk landing video, whilst on the ground will derotate the nose. But once you're in the air, if you pull full backstick too low to the ground, then you have that tail strike risk, which is what happened here. Yeah, so quite a significant event. And then just in the summary here, the nose landing gear wheel separated due to the impact of the nose landing gear of the runway, and one wheel was sucked into engine number 1, causing the engine to stall. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Other system failures occurred due to the impact of the nose landing gear, and these caused the aircraft to revert to alternate law. The flight crew diverted to another airport and eventually landed the aircraft. So, two bounces, tail strike, nose landing gear separation, engine stall, alternate law. I mean, that's a bad day, isn't it, really? Okay, so let's have a look at some of the contributing factors then. So the first item that's been highlighted here is high tailwind gradients, speed lower than VAP -5 from 100 feet. Flare at 14 feet, the thrust levers are pushed above the climb detent. This is going to prevent the spoilers from coming out. Hard landing on the main gear and bounce when the pitch call out, at which point then full nose down input and idle thrust, spoilers deployed, nose gear, heavy impact, and then pitch increase due to the nose landing gear bouncing, pitch auto call out, toga thrust on full nose up, tail strike at lift off on the go around. So there's a number of opportunities here to prevent this from happening. So we'll have a look at the role of the pilot monitoring here briefly. So the FCOM SOP for landing requests a speed call out by the pilot monitoring in the case of speed variations of 5 knots below the speed target. The pilot flying should initiate a go around unless they consider that a stabilised condition can be recovered by small corrections to the aircraft within sufficient time prior to landing. This is where it alludes a little bit to that transient conditions we spoke of earlier. So that's the important thing. Unless they consider that a stabilised condition can be recovered by small corrections to the aircraft within a sufficient time prior to landing. But it's the pilot monitoring responsible to highlight that and bring it to the attention of the pilot flying by calling speed. The FCTM states that the risk of a tail strike is increased due to the high angle of attack and pitch attitude if the speed of the aircraft is allowed to decrease too far below VAP before the flare. And I mentioned earlier on about one of the contributing factors towards a tail strike is allowing the speed to decay too much and the nose of the attitude, the angle of attack to increase too much. Of course, on the SOPs on the 320, it's if the pitch gets towards 10 degrees, and of course you're going to call pitch. And on the 321, from memory, it's around 7.5 degrees. So again, there's another few calls there that pilot monitoring has got in order to assist the pilot flying and assist their situational awareness. Looking at step 1 in the event described above, it shows that the speed went below VAP -5 from 100 feet and below. If the PM had called or made the speed call out, then the pilot flying may have noticed the speed decay and attempted to correct it or initiate a go around if it was not likely that it was able to stabilise in time. So perhaps that call might have just brought it to the attention of the pilot flying much sooner, and he may have even initiated a go around from close to the ground at that point, in which case would have mitigated much of this. The flare height, the FCOM states that in a stabilised approach, the flare height should be initiated at 30 feet. Well, that's not strictly true. And in fact, when we come on later on into the article, and if you read the FCOM on the flare height, it says around 30 feet. So let's just be careful here that it's not at 30 feet. It's around 30 feet, and we'll look at some of the environmental conditions that might change that. for the A320 family aircraft. These values for other aircraft, other Airbus may be provided later in this article. We're not going to cover that. The FCTM recommends initiating the flare earlier if there is a tailwind. This is because a tailwind will contribute to a higher ground speed with an associated increase in the vertical speed to maintain the approach slope. So the higher the ground speed, the higher the descent rate to maintain that 3-degree glide. So the argument there is you might consider flaring slightly earlier. Initiating the flare earlier would have reduced the high vertical speed of the aircraft in the event described above. So, thrust lever management. The A320 FCTM explains that the flight crew can rapidly retard all thrust levers to idle either earlier or later than the 20-foot retard auto call-out reminder, depending on the conditions. So, 20 feet reminder is simply a reminder, but you have the ability as pilots and the flexibility as pilots to retard the thrust just before or just after, depending on the conditions. However, the thrust levers should be at idle by touchdown to ensure the ground spoilers will extend and then dump the lift to keep the aircraft on the ground. Now, if I haven't mentioned it already, I'll put a link above where I talk about ground spoiler logic, partial deployment and phased lift dumping, which is quite a clever module within the ground spoiler logic. Moving on to step 2 then of the event, the pilot flying pushed the thrust levers above the climb detent during the flare. This increased the thrust and inhibited the ground spoiler extension during the final touchdown, which contributed to the aircraft bounce. Because the spoilers didn't dump the lift, the aircraft just launched itself back into the air again. So the article then moves on to bounce management and a nice review of the guidance in the FCTM about high bounces. So for a high bounce, as was the case in the incident described above, the FCTM recommends maintaining the aircraft's pitch attitude and performing a go-around. So after the high bounce, maintain the pitch and then execute the go-around. Of course, what happened in this case after their high bounce was they pulled full aft stick, and it's that caused the tail strike. The hard impact of the nose landing gear with the runway described in step 4 of the event was caused by a number of things. By extension of the ground spoilers when the thrust levers were retarded to idle during the bounce, combined with full forward stick after the bounce. A reminder here of the go-around close to the ground. The FCTM recommends avoiding an excessive rotation rate during the go-around close to the ground and to counter any pitch up effect due to the thrust increase. In step 5 of the event, it was the full back stick combined with the nose landing gear bounce and thrust increase that contributed to the tail strike. So just in that last moment there after the bounce, full toga thrust, they're low to the ground, high pitch attitude, high rotation rate, and that's ultimately what caused the tail strike. So quite a significant event then, of course, with the tyre actually going into engine number 1, causing that to stall. It's quite remarkable. That's the only thing that happened to the engine. You'd expect it to rip it off the wing. I mean, the nose gear wheels, they're not small. So quite a lot to take away from that, because quite a lot happened. The importance of effective pilot monitoring, the effects of a tailwind on the approach, the effects and the guidance, or the effects of a bounce, and the guidance in the FCTM to what to do with a high bounce, and the importance of managing that go around when close to the ground. So a really good event to study. So then we go on to case study number 2. This is A321 nose landing gear landing. So let's talk about the event description first. So the A321 performed an ILS approach in night conditions. The weather was fine and there was a 10-knot headwind. So it looks like a very nice evening. The flight crew switched off the autopilot at 940 feet rad out, kept the flight directors on, the auto thrust was on, and the speed was stabilized at approach speed. So all looking good so far. From 110 feet radio altimeter to 50 feet radio altimeter, the pilot flying applied several nose up inputs that increased the aircraft's pitch attitude to 3.8 degrees nose up. So this has got all the hallmarks here of flaring a little bit too high or a little bit too early. The auto thrust command of the thrust increased to maintain VAP, and that's normal behaviour. The aircraft consequently flew over the runway threshold at around 40 feet with a vertical speed close to 0. So here we are, just basically flying down the runway over the threshold at 40 feet, having commenced the flare too early. The pilot flying applied several pitch up inputs that maintained the nose pitch up attitude, and the aircraft subsequently floated above the runway for 4 seconds at around 20 feet radio altimeter. The pilot flying retarded the thrust levers progressively to idle. So again, remember, if you retard the thrust levers progressively, all you're doing is all you're keeping is the auto thrust in manual thrust, limiting the thrust basically as you bring it back. So you're not taking the thrust off, you're just limiting the thrust. Because what's really important at the appropriate height to rapidly select the thrust levers to idle. So I think what's happening here is the flare was a little bit too early, and I think that was also, or certainly is, one of the factors in tail strike events. Long floats and potentially running outside of the touchdown zone again, which of course has its own disadvantages or threats to safety. Okay, so there the aircraft, the pilot flying applied several pitch up inputs that maintain the nose pitch up attitude, and the aircraft subsequently floated above the runway for 4 seconds at around 20 feet. The pilot flying then retarded the thrust levers progressively to idle. 4 seconds later, the aircraft was at around 10 feet. The pilot flying then applied full forward stick. The nose landing gear heavily impacted the runway 660 meters after the runway threshold, followed by the main landing gear. So again, we've got this sort of porpoise of the main gear and then rotating around, sort of porpoising of the nose gear and then rotating around the main gear. So very similar to the event on the 320 we discussed earlier on. Both nose landing gear wheels separated due to the severe impact, and the aircraft finally stopped on the runway centerline, resting on its nose landing gear axle. That's quite extraordinary, isn't it? The abuse these aircraft can get and still land is quite extraordinary. Not that I'm advocating exploring the envelope here, guys, but it's quite remarkable. So I don't know, was having the flare too early and floating down the runway, not retarding the thrust levers early enough, things that we can see on the line, particularly on training sectors, and lots of opportunity here to throw this away, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But of course, I suspect full forward side stick input here was probably due to the fact they were running out of runway or running out of touchdown zone and to try and get the aircraft on the ground. So looking at the contributing factors here, at point 1, the flare height initiated at 110 feet. That's very high or very early. The runway threshold overflown at 40 feet with a VS close to 0. So we're just basically just flying down the runway at this point. Idle thrust at 20 feet rad out after a sort of a long float, and then point 3, full forward stick input at 10 feet radio altimeter, causing the nose gear to impact the runway. So the article then goes on to operational considerations, and the first thing it talks about is the flare height. Now, the FCOM recommends a flare manoeuvre of around 30 feet for the A320 family aircraft in a stabilised condition. So the important thing here is around 30 feet, and we'll look at some environmental conditions where that might affect that flare height. The flare described in case study 2 was initiated too early at 110 feet radio altimeter, and the oil thrust was kept engaged. This led to the aircraft crossing the runway threshold with a vertical speed close to 0. So remember, the thrust levers aren't brought back to idle. All you'll do is just vary the amount of maximum thrust the auto thrust will give you. So you'll still have thrust, which is what happened in this case. The auto thrust is active and targets the approach speed or the selected speed as long as the thrust levers are not in the retarded idle detent. That's what caused this thrust to increase. In the event, the aircraft descent rate was almost 0 feet per minute at the runway threshold. The auto thrust was still active. That's because the thrust levers remained in the climb detent at that point, and targeting the approach speed. This led to the aircraft to float above the runway for several seconds until the pilot flying retarded the thrust levers. Pitch control. The FCTM states that the pilot flying must avoid using nose down inputs once the flare is initiated. The pilot flying can release the back stick input slightly as required. Remember, the aircraft is trimming nose down in order to give you that artificial feel, so there really is no need to push forward. In step 3 of this event, the aircraft pitch down effect due to the full forward stick input combined with the aircraft's descent rate resulted in a heavy impact of the nose landing gear with the runway surface. The go around decision. The FCTM states that if a normal touchdown point cannot be reached, a go around or rejected landing should be performed. In this event, the appropriate action would have been for the pilot flying to initiate a go-around when the aircraft was in the float condition above the runway. So then the article moves on to a recipe for a safe landing. So the recommendations below summarise the procedures and techniques provided in the FCOM and the FCTM. The first thing is the aim is to be stabilised. A safe flare can only be achieved when the aircraft is stabilised, meaning that all of the flight parameters areas expected, including the aircraft is on the expected final flight path, that's both vertical and lateral, the speed is close to V approach, and the wings are level. And again, there will be criteria at 1,000 feet, probably almost certainly 500 feet in your operations manual, that certain criteria have to be met, and this is for both pilots to monitor and particularly for pilot monitoring to call out. And of course, if these criteria aren't met, then a go around must be executed. If the aircraft reaches the flare height at the correct speed and is on the expected path, then a normal flare technique will lead to a safe landing. The pilot monitoring must call out any flight parameter deviation, and this is where the pilot monitoring's role is very, very important. Remember, the pilot monitoring has arguably got more capacity than the pilot flying, particularly in very challenging circumstances. The pilot flying's capacity might be mostly absorbed, and the pilot monitoring arguably has got a bit more capacity, so they're able to scan the instruments and scan the attitude of the aircraft as well as the pilot flying, but perhaps arguably with more capacity, with more effect. And so it's in his remit, it's the pilot monitoring responsibility to call out this deviation. That will then alert the pilot flying to that parameter, and then they can decide whether or not there is time enough to actually make the necessary corrections to carry out the landing or execute a go-around. So the article then goes on to say, careful monitoring of the flight parameters, including speed, pitch, bank and vertical speed, enables the pilot monitoring to raise the attention to the pilot flying to any deviation during the final approach. This will enable pilot flying to respond accordingly and initiate a go-around if required. Refer to the FCOM SOP for approach for more information about the pilot monitoring call-out related to flight parameters deviation threshold. Again, this is going to be covered in your company SOP. And then it goes on to the flare at the right time. Now, the flare should be initiated at around 30 feet. And again, it's not at 30 feet, it's around 30 feet. And some of the factors that may require an earlier initiation of the flare are listed here. And I've got a little diagram here for you. The diagram isn't fantastic actually, but anyway, it adds a little bit of a context to it. So the factors that may require an earlier rotation of the flare are as follows. A steeper approach slope, so more than a nominal 3 degrees. You can imagine if the approach angle is higher, the rate of descent is going to be higher, the energy is going to be slightly greater, so an earlier flare might be required. An increasing runway slope or rising terrain before the runway threshold. So we've also got airports that have, if you like, a a raised part or an elevation on the first third of the runway. There are lots of airports that have this, and of course the ground is coming up to meet you, as it were, as well as your descent rate. So that closure rate in the last part of the flare, of course, could be quite significant. So an earlier flare might be required. Tailwind again, or an increasing tailwind. Again, the rate of descent is going to be greater for a nominal 3 degree, for example, and of course an earlier flare might be required. And of course high airport elevation, low density altitude. So flare at the right time, but also flare correctly. And of course, a reminder on Airbus fly-by-wire aircraft, the pilot should apply a progressive and gentle backstick order until touchdown. Remember, the aircraft's trimming forward to give you that artificial field. The pilot flying must avoid forward stick once the flare has been initiated. The pilot flying can gradually release the backstick if required, but the pilot flying must perform a go-around if a normal touchdown point cannot be reached. So it's just a reminder here, there's no need to push forward once you start the flare. You can just relax the back pressure, and if you're not going to land in the normal touchdown zone, then initiate a go-around. Now again, if it's that late on, obviously you're going to do a go-around close to the ground, and it's something else that we covered in the video, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Any forward stick input after the flare initiated will increase the risk of landing with the nose landing gear with a hard impact with the runway surface. So just as we saw in those two events, a common theme of both of those events was a full forward stick input in the flare, which caused the nose gear to touch first, and then that sort of porpoise for the bounce. Retard. This is the auto call out you hear on the 320. That comes at 20 feet, and it's just a reminder, remember, it's not an order. So the pilot flying can retard the thrust levers earlier or later depending on the conditions. So the flare height may differ depending on the conditions, and also the point at which you retard the thrust levers can vary. The pilot flying must ensure, however, that thrust levers are at idle in any case by touchdown at the latest to enable automatic extension of the ground spoilers. Delaying the retard of the thrust levers may increase the landing distance because the auto thrust will target VAP or the selected speed until it is disconnected by moving the thrust levers to idle. Remember, just because they're out of the climb detent, you've still got the auto thrust engaged there, but you're just limiting it. All right, so it might still be commanding the approach until they're actually at idle. Maintain the aircraft pitch in the case of a bounce. So this is a reminder here of the technique in the FCTM, which talks about light bounce and heavy bounces. So the FCTM recommends to maintain the pitch attitude in the case of a light bounce at landing. The aircraft will make a second lighter touchdown and the landing roll can continue. So light bounce, maintain the pitch and continue your landing. The FCTM recommends to maintain the pitch attitude and initiate a go-around in the case of a high bounce. So slightly different in terms of how we're going to manage this, but the common theme is on the bounce is to maintaining that pitch attitude. Maintaining the pitch attitude and counteracting any pitch up tendency due to the thrust increase enables the flight crew to avoid the tail strike and ensure a softer secondary touchdown should this occur. Now I covered this in the video on balk landing, and if you touch the second time you might just get the takeoff config warning because you've hit go around, takeoff thrust, and you're not in the takeoff config, because if you're landing in config full, that is. So a high bounce, maintain the pitch, apply the go around thrust, counteract any pitch up tendency due to the thrust increase to avoid tail strike until safely established in the go around. So on that second high bounce you may well contact the runway again, but again just maintain toga, maintain the pitch attitude, and then once you're established in the go around safely away from the ground, you can then call go around flaps. And a reminder here also to be go around minded. So the pilot flying must perform a go around if at any parameter deviation becomes excessive or if the aircraft is destabilized prior to the flare. If the aircraft floats above the runway, the flight crew must initiate a go-around instead of attempting to recover the situation. And the FC10 talks about this technique in a go-around close to the ground. It's slightly different to the bounce landing where we maintain the pitch attitude. The go-around close to the ground just talks about getting safely away from the ground before we then call go-around flaps, just to avoid any over-rotation and the chance of striking the tail. So here's just a reminder that the go-around, whether it's a go-around close to the ground or a recovery from the bounce landing, you can go around from that at any time until the thrust levers are selected into reverse. So any time up until that point, then the go-around is available to you. But once the thrust levers are selected to reverse, then you must continue with the landing. Avoid excessive rotation rate in the go-around close to the ground. This is talking about the go-around close to the ground here. When the flight crew initiates a go-around close to the ground, they must avoid an excessive rotation rate to limit the risk of a tail strike. The flight crew must wait until the aircraft is safely established in the go-around before retracting the flaps by one step and then raising the gear. I cover this in the bulk landing technique. So the question here is, well, what should my pitch attitude be? And again, that's something which I cover in the bulk landing procedure, and it might be something that your operations manuals already cover as far as bulk landing, give you some guidance there. So then the article then concludes, and I'll just read this in here because it's a nice little summary. The landing phases are very demanding and it requires good coordination between both flight crew. The FCOM procedure and FCTM provide the recommended techniques that must be carefully followed to ensure a safe landing. The pilot flying must ensure that the aircraft is established on the expected flying approach path at the correct approach speed. They will apply progressive backstick input at the correct height, which has been determined depending on the external parameters. So remember, it's not at a specific height. Any forward stick inputs must be avoided once the flare is initiated. The thrust levers must be retarded to idle at touchdown, at least for the ground spoilers to deploy. In the case of a bounce at touchdown, the pilot flying must maintain the pitch attitude, decide to either continue the landing if the bounce was light, or to go around if it's a high bounce. In the case of a high bounce, the pilot flying must not attempt to land the aircraft by applying nose down pitch on the side stick. It may be that when you maintain that pitch attitude you have a second contact, but it should be lighter and then you can commence your go around. The pilot monitoring also plays an essential role throughout the entire landing sequence. The pilot monitoring is expected to call out any deviations to the flight parameter to the pilot flying, which will ensure that the pilot flying can react accordingly or initiate a go-around if the deviation cannot be corrected in a timely manner. Avoiding an excessive rotation rate of the aircraft for a go-around initiated close to the ground will prevent a tail strike. The pilot flying must be prepared for a go-around and initiate a go-around in the case of a late destabilisation of the aircraft or if the aircraft floats above the runway. A go-around can be initiated at any time during the flare or the landing roll until the thrust reversers are selected. However, when the reversers are selected, the landing must be continued. Good. Well, I think that nicely wraps up the Airbus Safety Magazine and the focus on the flare. Lots of good stuff from that, really, and those two case studies really highlight the importance of the correct flare height, correct side stick input, correct thrust lever management, and a nice review of what to do in the event of a bounce and a go around technique and a go around from close to the ground. As always, thank you very much for watching. Thank you to all those that support the channel. Hope you're enjoying the content. Stay safe, keep the plates spinning, and I'll look forward to seeing you again for another episode very soon. Bye for now.